All right. I guess I'll get started. So good afternoon, hello, perhaps good morning, everyone, friends of the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance. I see some familiar names in the room today, so thank you very much for your loyalty and for joining us for our second webinar series of year 2024. So we are continuing our conversation on administrative traditions in African countries. And today we are joined by two professors who will be talking about two different case studies, Professor Lekorwe on Botswana and Professor Auerbach on a case study on South Africa. So at CASP, there are three of us. There is myself, I'm Adila Kodabux, and I'm from currently Middlesex University, Mauritius branch campus. And there's my colleague, Dr. Imamdin Fohim from the University of Bern, the KPM Center. And there is also my colleague, Dr. Amar Siama, as well from Middlesex University, Mauritius. Each one of us, we are from three different disciplines. And we started the idea of CASP back in 2020. We knew one another professionally through our network at Middlesex University, and that started during Imamdin's visit at the campus, I believe a few years before 2020. So during the pandemic, we continued our conversation online, and we reflected on our disciplines, how we can connect our knowledge. And of course, we were talking about the essence of public governance in Africa and how it is adapting to technologies and also being mindful of local domestic traditions in respective unique African contexts. So that paved the idea for the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance, abbreviated to CASP. And we've had every year since then, we've had at least a webinar series or a lecture series. So in 2021, we've had our webinar series where we talked about the three different aspects of public governance, African context, and smart governance. And all of that conversation as well, we were very pleased to reflect on an essay in the African Journal of Management that was published last year. And overall, our aim as a center as well is both of a theoretical nature and of a practical nature. Theoretically, we aim to add to the field of study on African context and of course related to public administration and enhancement of public governance theoretical understanding from an African perspective. Practically as well, we aim to be working with practitioners and to be able to learn from them and as well as contribute insights that can practically improve our understanding of how the field works. In fact, we have a chapter coming up, I believe by the end of this year or earlier, where we'll be talking about the management of public transport in Mauritius and how the implementation of the Metro Express, the light rail transit system, how it was mindful of local context. So keep an eye on updates from us and on our chapter. No spoiler alert. So we will be sharing the link perhaps to read our chapter once it is officially out. And yes, additionally, something new we've had over the last, a new initiative we've had over the last 6 months officially. We've had one new intern, Ronia, and one associate fellow, Metkel. I think I've seen Metkel, not sure if I've seen Ronia in the room today, but we are really, really pleased to have them. I mean, officially they are in this title role, I think in the last months, but they have been involved in CASP in one way or another for some time. So we really, really appreciate their input and them taking the time as well to be in our weekly meetings and to contribute our views as well on how we can enhance the work that we do at CASP. So thank you for that. And yes, without too much talk on my side, and before I leave to Amandine to share further, as I said, for a second webinar today, we will be talking about administrative, our webinar series theme for this year is on administrative traditions in African countries. And we were very pleased in our very first webinar to have Professor Peters with us. And we've had a broad overview of public administration back then. And it was a very dynamic conversation that we've had during the Q&A. And that was that left us with a lot of food for thought as well on how to take this further. So we have thought about case studies that we wish to look at, and there are currently 6 of them. And this week we are really, really pleased to be welcoming Professor Lekorwe and Professor Auerbach, as I said, who will be talking about Botswana and South Africa, respectively. And on that note, we move to the next slide, and we will have other sessions as well, third webinar in September and another one in November, where we will be talking about different case studies as well, Senegal, Cabo Verde, and Ghana and Mauritius, different speakers, and our final concluding webinar in 2025, where we will collect all the insights. We will be synthesizing the reflections over this year's webinar series, and we will aim to provide some sort of comparison or some reflection as well. We have a bigger project as well in mind, which hopefully we will share more updates in due course. And we are really, really grateful to all our speakers for taking the time and for responding positively to our invitation to share with us multiple perspectives. So on that note, Amandine, over to you.
Thank you, Adila, for the introduction. I just want to use the opportunity also to thank to the Digitalization Committee of the University of Bern. They sponsored this webinar series through this project, which is called Mensch in digitale Transformation, so the human in digital transformation. That's also the project where we want to go with this webinar series in the future. So I also would like to welcome, if you go to the next slides, to those participants today who might have joined our series webinar today, who are coming from the annual conference of the Commission for Research Partnership with Developing Countries, KFPE. So we thought that might be also a good opportunity to discuss a bit our goals, our endeavor, because what is there really relevant and definitely makes sense. They have established these 11 principles of how to do transparent research partnerships. And we want to show a bit as an example as how we do it. We're not saying we do it perfectly, but maybe to create a discussion on how things can be done. As Adila already said, this webinar series is actually a preparatory work for a broader, bigger research proposal we want to submit. So the idea through this webinar series is exactly to address some of these principles that are in this guide and that I really recommend to read and go through in case you are also involved in transboundary research partnership. So for example, as it said, that you should set the agenda together, all the involved partners. You should ensure to get local context, collaborate with local stakeholders in order to understand much better the context, create a network. So that's exactly a bit the idea with this webinar series, so that we can already learn early from each other, and thanks to today's technology, we can also do that more easily. We are also planning to have a research workshop in Bern next year to address other principles like responsibilities, beneficiaries, of the Envisage research project. And so that's a bit the idea, and maybe helpful in order to better address those principles of the guide. So thank you also for those participants joining our webinar today. I would like to jump to today's topic and introduce the two speakers, Professor Mogopodi Lekorwe and Professor Jess Auerbach. I had already the pleasure to work with both of them, and that's why I'm really glad and I'm happy that both are joining us today and are part of this research, bigger research project we want to address in the future. So let me start with Mogopodi Lekorwe, who is Associate Professor in Public Administration at the University of Botswana. He holds a degree in Politics and Administration, a Master in Business Administration, and Doctorate in Development Administration and Management. But he has created and done a lot of initiatives already. He has been executive training program developer for the Center of Public Administration and Management. He was also director of this center. He is national investigator for the Afrobarometer project, which is a project that undertakes research in over 35 countries in Africa. He has already been a speaker in our inaugural webinar series back then in 21. And the collaboration we have together that I also am happy to raise in this moment, we have a virtual exchange seminar. That means students from the University of Botswana and the students from University of Bern here in Switzerland, they are virtually connected in one class on the topic of public management reforms and innovation. So we can have a cross-cultural dialogue, and Mogopodi was much involved in order to make this initiative happen. So thank you very much, Mogopodi, for being here. And also thank you very much, Jess Auerbach, for being here, who is Associate Professor and Program Director for the MPhil program in Inclusive Innovation at the University of Cape Town in the Graduate Schools of Business. She has a Master of Science in Forced Migration from the Oxford University, PhD in Anthropology from Stanford University. Her research explores narrative, digital connectivity, sensory experience, and communication and education futures. She's really passionate about how networks and personal experience shape individual and collective impact, has conducted research in many countries, amongst other Angola, Mauritius, South Africa, just to mention a couple of African countries. We also had the chance to collaborate recently together. We have an ongoing research in the Sociology of Organizations volume on decolonizing management and organization studies, and she has the lead in a really important chapter where they reflect about how research partnerships can be improved, can be addressed among minority and majority world scholars to better address grand challenges of this day. So also keep an eye on that publication that will come out soon within the next month. So thank you very much to both of you. And we want to now give you the space. We start in alphabetical order regarding country name, which means Botswana, if that's okay for you. And so please, Mogopodi, the stage is yours. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, colleagues. I'll just say good afternoon using my time here because it's the afternoon. It may be morning or late evening at your places, but nevertheless, good afternoon. And I just want to express my gratitude for being with you and being in this very, very important webinar series. And my task today, I suspect I have 15 or so minutes to just present the case so that we can have much more time. So I will not be much longer here. I think my task today is to present on the Botswana case, just a case study on administrative traditions. And I have decided to call my piece the evolution of administrative traditions in Botswana, just a reflection. And I think what I want to do is to start off with the outline of what I'm going to talk about, just a brief outline, the background, introduction, and I would look at these three epochs, which are very important for us to reflect on the foundations laid by these three epochs, so that we can now look back and see where we are in terms of the general characteristics that were actually laid down by Professor Guy Peters in the introductory to this webinars. I think in terms of the background information, I should not assume that people know much about Botswana. Just the background information that Botswana is a country, the southern part of Africa, a landlocked country, a big country in terms of size, 582,000 square kilometers. It's often said is about roughly the size of France and Kenya or whatever. So in terms of the size, the country is taken to be big. And the name Botswana actually comes from the dominant ethnic group in the country. But we do have quite a number of other ethnic groups like the Kalankas and Debeles, the Herero, the San, which were the first people to occupy the territory. But the country has been named after this dominant group. And with this name, there's still some people who may not be very happy about naming the country Botswana because they feel that they were excluded. And every time there are discussions about that, there are certain groups which would raise that, but that's not a very big issue. The country is much more reliant on diamonds, which is a major economic resource for the country. But we are also known for being a cattle country. Rely much more on cattle, and I think many of you know about the Botswana beef, which is taken to be amongst the best in the world. Population-wise, I'm giving up the 1964 estimates just before independence to show that we are a country that is big, but in terms of the population-wise, we are quite few. At that point in time, we're 550,000 people estimated, with about 35,000 absentees, basically in South African mines and other places. Now, when you look at the 2022 estimates, just roughly over 2 million, 2.4 million roughly. And this has caused a lot of uneasiness. Even the statistician general was saying that this is a negative growth, and people are worried that the population is growing negatively. In terms of the constitutional framework, the country is a constitutional democracy, which means that the country really provides for three arms of government. That is the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. We have a National Assembly with 57 members of parliament who are elected directly from the constituencies. And amongst this, we have 6 who are specially elected members. These are elected by parliament. Although in reality, we know that it will be the ruling party which will always win it, because they are in numbers. They will bring the people that they have nominated. So this would bring a total of 63 members in the National Assembly. And currently there are discussions, as we'll show maybe towards the end, that they want to increase that number from 6 elected ones to 10. And that would mean even the executive now, those who would have won the majority of members of parliament would have a chance to increase their numbers in terms of parliament. We also have the second layer, the House of Chiefs, I would say, as it was called previously, but now we call it in Setswana, Nkuyadi Kgosi, meaning House of Chiefs. This also forms part of the unicameral legislature. Currently, it's made up of 35 traditional leaders. And again, there's an attempt to increase the number by nominating others who will now be nominated by the president. Basically, this house just serves as an advisory body. It doesn't have any legislative powers nor even veto powers. But the Constitution insists that it must be consulted when the constitution is being reviewed or amended. So their real mandate here is that they have to be consulted on matters of tribal law and customs. And I think this is still respected because it really laid the foundation of the current administrative system. We also have now the local government system where we have district and urban councils and the tribal administration and land boards. This will become clearer as we go because these, again, were institutions which were brought in actually to even marginalize the chiefs, because chiefs in the pre-colonial era and even during the colonial era had a lot of powers, and therefore that's why they formed the basis of administration. But we'll see how their powers now were being reduced through the introduction of some of these institutions. Now, coming to this, we realize that we understand that Botswana is largely seen as a success story in terms of a democracy compared to many other African countries. The country enjoyed relatively large economic growth, and it is a stable democracy. And administratively, the country borrowed from different models, and it utilized Anglo-American traditions as well as borrowing from the Scandinavian models. And therefore, we can say that really there is no one single model which is applied in the country. Now, looking at the different epochs that we want to dwell on, which actually laid the foundation for the current administrative systems. During the pre-colonial era, we're looking at the period before 1885. Botswana, just like many other African countries, before 1700, had very few contacts with Europeans. And it was at that time that we had the chiefs, which were the ones in control. And these hereditary chiefs and kings governed their people with the advice of village elders. So the chiefs at that time were the locus of power for various people because they had the power, as they were even given the power to allocate almost everything: economic resources, land, you name them, land for grazing, land for farming. The chiefs were the ones in control. So amongst all, these people actually wielded great powers, as they had even a large number of cattle, which were often loaned to their own tribesmen or their supporters, which now made them even more powerful. So they were the ultimate decision makers when it comes to judicial and political questions. Also, at that point in time, society believed that the chiefs had connections, some connections with the ancestors, which meant that they commanded a lot of respect. It was believed that the chiefs could call upon the intervention of these ancestors in times of crisis. So because of that, they commanded a lot of respect. And the chiefs at that time used several institutions to administer their territories. And it is these institutions that I would like now to look at. One of these institutions in the Botswana context is what is known as the Khotla system. The Khotla here is an assembly or a place for adult males, which basically served as a judicial chamber, administrative body, or as an advisory to the chief. That means that as a traditional administrative system, it was seen as an institution which served as a forum for policy formulation, decision-making, including political and economic developmental activities, and judiciary, especially on litigations. This is what the Khotla was supposed to do. And this was the starting point for the administrative system. This is how things worked during that era. And it's an institution which still continues today, but we'll see how an attempt was made to modernize it, but not necessarily to do away with it. And this is what will be interesting at the end to look at it, looking at the powers of the chiefs and this institution vis-a-vis the current governance system. The other institution that we want to talk about is this one called Dikgafela. Dikgafela here, it's a Tswana term to mean harvest. It was common practice amongst the various ethnic groups for a long time to actually engage in this activity, although now it seems a bit extinct, although in some areas they're trying to revive it. With this activity, after a harvesting season, every household that makes a particular land would contribute a determined portion, and that portion would be determined by the leadership of their harvest. And this is collected and stored at the khotla, at that place that we talked about. It's stored at the khotla in the big community silos. In Setswana, we call them dihala. This will be collected and be stored in that place. So these harvested grains were used to feed the clan warriors, especially during wars, or they could be distributed back to society during drought seasons. This traditional activity, therefore, signifies how leadership collects from people, and that which is collected is now turned into a common pool to benefit the entire community. This, in my view, represents public administration or an administrative system in its simplest form. We also look at security, which we look at it as a social good provision. Security here for a long time has been a critical aspect, and Tswana societies definitely had to defend themselves from power-hungry leaders with more powerful armies. So security here was treated as a social good because no private household could provide such to the whole clan. So in this case, the clan leaders would actually recruit males of a certain age and physique from all the households to establish an army that will defend the clan. This again represents the provision of a public good through mobilizing from the people. And I believe this was also part of an administrative system that was evolving. We then look at Bogwera and Bojale, which are basically initiation schools. And before Western education, Botswana had their own form of education in the form of these initiation schools. One is called Bogwera, and Bogwera basically is for males and Bojale for females. So for young males and females, they had to go through the process of being transitioning from childhood to either a woman or a man. They had to go through this process, and the clan would have to share the costs, which included the food, human resources, and many other forms in the form of contributions and even volunteering. And this is also an administrative activity, especially when you look at it at the allocative level. So the chiefs were actually doing this. But over time, this also sort of died a natural death until some chiefs now started reviving it. And we'll see that it's a very, very good institution because when you have these people, they belong to a regiment. Once you graduate from Bojale or Bogwera as a woman or as a man, you now belong to a certain social organization called a regiment. And that means that these people will always be ready to be called upon by the chief in case of any kind of projects that would be undertaken. So they would provide that kind of available labor for chiefs to cut costs in society because they belong to a particular regiment. Anytime when in the village, when there's a big project that has to be undertaken and it's found that there may not be enough funds to do, the best thing is to call for the regiment and we'll be ready to go. And we take pride in that you belong to that. That was part of the administrative system. Now, transitioning to the colonial era, I think here I want to underscore the point that we talk about the colonial era in Botswana, but the country was declared a protectorate and not a colony. And of course, this was because tribal leaders had approached the British government to protect them against the Boers and German imperialism. But it's very clear the reasons why maybe even the British were not interested in having Botswana as a colony. And this statement make it very, very clear that they were not interested. It says we have no interest in the country to the north of the Molope, that meaning the river, except as a road to the interior. We might therefore confine ourselves for the present to prevent that part of the protectorate being occupied either by filibusters or foreign power. So I think this statement clearly captures that the British were not very interested. That's why we sometimes not classified as a colony, but just as a protectorate. So the British colonialism, we'll just say that, although now we know it's not really, brought parallel rule or indirect rule, which actually meant that the chiefs continued their rule. So it meant that even if they were coming on board, they were not going to do a lot in terms of meddling with what was going on in terms of the administrative system. But as time went on, and as we see here, what it meant was it remained very minuscule and had very little interaction with the colonial indigenous peoples. That's what the British actually did. So the chiefs kept their institutional powers over their people, including judicial, legislative, and executive functions. So it meant that the administrative system continued, and the Tswana population kept their institutional setting. And as I've already said, they didn't show any kind of interest. But there were some attempts also to try and bring them on board, even though there was no intention of really meddling with the system. They also wanted to, the British wanted to bring them somehow closer. And they did this through the introduction of a hard tax. And this hard tax was to be collected from every household by the chiefs. So the chiefs were now made to participate in British colonial administration, if you want to say. And they collected this hard tax and then passed it on to the High Commissioner or the Resident Commissioner, because the country was not a colony. Even the headquarters was outside the country. It was being administered from outside the country. So the tax was used largely for administrative expenses rather than for developmental activities. So we can say that public administration in colonial Botswana was very minimal. And the British, let me say, they actually, in terms of the hard tax, the chiefs benefited a lot from this because they took some percentage from whatever tax that they were collecting. And this means that they were being made a bit powerful vis-a-vis their own populations, but they also had to try to strike a balance between local interests and the demands of colonial administration. So the implications here were that, well, the chiefs continued making important decisions, and in many cases, they were not really overruled by the resident commissioners or the higher commissioners. But the implications of this were that political institutions were relatively untouched, and the chiefs still presided over tribal courts, and their magical and religious functions that we talked about were replaced by Christianity, and they benefited personally through collection of taxes as agents because they took some percentage from that, and also they benefited from political arrangement with the colonial administration. But we should also understand that although the impression sometimes given is that governing through the quota system, things were harmonious, the chiefs were somehow autocratic, and they continued being autocratic even during this era, even continuing into the post-independence era. So it should not be understood that when we say they were governing their own people through this, everything was harmonious. They were using the quota and using the assembly with this advice from the elders, but those elders basically would be coming from people who are royal, who are closer to the chief. And even when these quota meetings are called, people would be called to sound out their opinions. And after that, the chief now would stand up and pronounce, according to him, pronounce the perception of what he sees as the community consensus. So it only meant that it was a sounding board and decisions would have been taken elsewhere. Now, coming to the post-independence administrative system, here we see now around 1964-65, the introduction of political parties in the country, gradually coming to independence, and the first elections being held, and therefore becoming independent. And that naturally meant that we now had a different system, which now introduced some administrative setup. But prior to that, the nationalist movements were opposed to traditional authorities. Some political parties just before independence were very much opposed to traditional authorities because they actually wanted to take over the government from the British. So some of these political parties actually were very, very clear that they were openly anti-chiefs. But the ruling party, the Democratic Party, which is still ruling since 1966, actually won the elections. And it was a different ball game now because the party at that point in time was led by someone who was of chiefly origins. So the new government came in, but continued working with the chiefs. So there was no attempt to try and displace this institution. But the chiefs themselves now, they were downgraded because of the introduction of the district councils. That was the very, very first time that the chiefs' powers were now being eroded because many of their powers now were being transferred to these institutions, the district councils, and the chiefs were now simply made ex officio members in this, and even non-voting status in the council. That was the first kind of legislation that was passed by the National Assembly to try and reduce the powers of the chiefs. That was the district councils when they were being established. Then the Tribal Land Act of 1968, again, being introduced to now take the powers of the chiefs in terms of allocating land. And that was a very, very powerful kind of thing. But now the land powers were taken from the chiefs, and these powers were now given to these land boards. Again here, the chiefs were made ex officio members and just given one vote. That was effected through this act. And now, this meant that the Chieftainship Act of 1965 recognized the chiefs. What it also meant was now chiefs have to be recognized by the government and gazetted as such, which meant that any point in time, the Minister of Local Government can actually de-recognize a chief, either recognize or de-recognize a chief. So as time went on, these institutions now were being staffed by well-educated and trained people, which meant the chiefs were increasingly being marginalized in terms of administration. So they were left only with the powers of administering in tribal matters only, and which was actually a problem. It started, and because now when they were being gazetted, it meant they became civil servants. And if they became civil servants, it meant that they can be controlled by the central government. And I think this is one of the turning points in the sense that some chiefs were basically against this, such that my own chief, which I will demonstrate at the end, actually refused to join the House of Chiefs, to join Nkluadi Khosi, because by joining Nkluadi Khosi, it would mean that this person is now a public servant and therefore would be controlled by a minister. He refused to join. He was installed as a chief, but refused to join the Nkluadi Khosi. He thought he could just do things outside the administrative arrangements, something which could not go well to an extent that he had to skip the country. And as we speak, he's also living outside the country because he could not continue ruling his own tribe without complying with the rules. In terms of the careers in the public service, I think here one can say that, you know, the public service in Botswana developed over decades, and it tends to be very competent, benefited a lot from expatriates, and the country avoided this fashionable thing about localization when they came on board. It remained critical in the policy process and worked hand in hand with the political wing. So in this case, we find that the senior public servants are now employed on contracts while other people are permanent and pensionable. So almost now putting in place, adopting the Westminster system and also complying with the Weberian model of doing things. But things now have taken a different turn. I think when I conclude, I'll just mention that interest groups and their relations with the state, I think here we see late development. In terms of the Botswana context, really, this is something that did not work very well for quite a long time. The Constitution, of course, provides for freedom of association, but the country leadership did not seem to be very much aligned to allowing people to unionize, to an extent that the interest groups that were allowed or which existed were those who were state-sponsored. The public servants were only allowed to belong to an association, and the one that existed at the time was the Botswana Civil Servants Association, which were mainly meant for consultation by government, rather than these people pushing for their own interest. So the trade union movements were only legalized in 2004, but for government employees, only those who were manual workers were allowed to unionize. The rest were just allowed to belong to this association, which was simply a sounding board. And they established the bargaining council in 2009. Again, very little commitment from the government in this case. And as we speak now, they resolved many of their issues through the courts because they never agreed. So really it meant the government was not very much interested. So it's a case where we see that a democracy developed with a very, very weak civil society, and these interest groups also suffered a major blow. The only ones that seem to be standing against the government are the teaching trade unions in the name of the federations like Botswana Federation of Public Sector Unions, which is basically a lot of them would be teachers, and the Federation of Trade Unions. But many of these people who are heading these institutions would be seconded to those from government. So you can see that there's very, very little commitment. Politicians and bureaucrats, the relationship, the separation is becoming very blurry now, with trained public servants now taking lead. They took lead in policy making and implementation, which made it easy for public servants to turn into politicians with ease. Although it was known that they respected the Barbarian model of neutrality of the civil servants. Even at that time, it was known that people could be occupying certain positions. Even if they were sympathetic to other parties, they would be doing their job. But now, after some time, we would see someone being a senior public servant today, and tomorrow, the following day, turning into a politician with ease. And that tended to blur down the division between politicians and bureaucrats. Citizens as an active participant under an administrative system, of course, this is being extended through the participation in policymaking, and mainly through the quota system that we have mentioned, where the government ministers and public servants would go to this for consultation purposes. However, it was mentioned that, no kind of politics would be allowed at the quota. So the quota still remained an apolitical institution. And here I've tried to slot in these kind of things according to Professor Guy Peter's characteristics, in terms of trying to show that many of these, they're following the hybrid systems, where there'll be a mix of that rather than just following one kind of model. But I think, for me, to conclude, I'm saying where from, where to, and the reformers. I'm mentioning these three people here because I think these three people would determine, at the end of the day, the kind of administrative system or administrative tradition that will define Botswana now. We have here, this is the current president, Masisi, who is the president. This is Khama, the former president. And what we see here, this is one of the chiefs, one of the paramount chiefs of one of the 8 main tribes. And I'm saying this carefully because the issue about the main tribes in the country is not well accepted. Some people challenge it that we don't have main, but this is what it is. The whole thing now changed when President Khama came into a position as the president. He is the son of the first president, who is the chief, who was the chief by birth. The father was a chief, but he never actually took over chieftainship because of the politics that went around. So Khama actually belongs to one of the big ethnic groups in the country, and he came to politics in a very interesting way. He was the commander of the army, and within 3 days, things changed. He resigned from the army today, joined the ruling party the next day, and the third day he was appointed the vice president of the country by the former president, Re Mogai. Mogai comes from his tribe, and Mogai is his subject. And therefore, this man was brought in into the party and into government. And since that time, things now tended to change, where he actually argued, Khama argued, that some civil servants were sabotaging the government programs, and therefore had to make sure that those who occupy senior positions are people who are sympathetic to the party. And that's when things started now changing. So starting to put different people in these positions because they believe that they were sympathetic to the party. But even during his time, you could find a civil servant standing in for primary elections in the party. When they lose, they're taken back to government positions. That's where now everything now started changing to saying that, where are we now? we are now confusing all these different systems. We thought people could be doing this, but they are doing something else. The former president, Mogai, before him, actually had a political advisor. The political advisor was somebody who was an activist in the party, and we believed that he was being given that position just to please him so that he doesn't make noise in the party. But when Khama came into power, he did not even have a political advisor. Now we have the current president. The current president, he spent the entire 3 years after coming to power trying to undo almost everything that he found in terms of reshuffling the top leadership in the public service. And this was because at that point, it was felt like some people were loyal to outsiders, meaning that they were still loyal to the former president. So a lot of times, people were being shuffled. Every 3 months, we knew that people would be moved around. That in itself has tended to disorganize, disorientate the public service. Now, when we come to this man who is the chief, this is the one that I said is one of the chiefs coming from one of the dominant tribes as well. And unfortunately, that's my tribe. This is my chief. He believed that the constitution of the country from the beginning, it's not a good constitution. He doesn't believe in it. He's a lawyer by training. He challenged that, and he was installed as a chief by Khama himself. He installed him as the chief, but it was during Khama's era again that he was de-recognized because he was refusing to join the House of Chiefs. He wanted just to operate on his own so that this tribe he can provide. So he actually suggesting that we go back to the earlier times when the chiefs were still in power. And because of that, he was charged with criminal activities and he escaped the country. As we speak now, he is in South Africa, just like Khama is in South Africa. So what is happening now? We see a situation where the current president, who is a commoner, when we talk about these two, now trying to challenge some of these issues coming from the chiefs to an extent that they are now even challenging, saying that Khama was never a chief. He was also installed as a chief some time back, but he never performed the functions of a chief because he was now in the army and then he was recruited into politics. So he never actually did that. But at this point in time, he now wanted to come back and maybe perform the functions of a chief. But because of this kind of conflict, currently the parliament is coming up with bills to say that he should never ever be considered in politics, like he can never even run for a council seat. And this is what they are targeting him for. So that the chieftainship now is becoming, is being under attack by the current president simply because of the deeds of these two people. So that's why I'm saying that the three people here will actually change the dynamics of the administrative system in the country. And I think with that, I will just conclude and saying that Botswana public administration system is young compared to the Western models, but the process of institutional transformation was a success because it never actually tried to abolish what was happening prior to that. It borrowed from other models to create its own. So the political and administrative wings continue to work hand in hand, but the role of other actors continue to grow as administration learns from other developed countries. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Mogopodi. Really interesting, really insightful. So that's exactly what we want to do. We have started with the administrative tradition as an overall concept that can be characterized through 7, or that can be determined through 7 characteristics. And now we want to go into the details. How does it look like? How is hybridity established? And so the evolution, understanding this insight will really be helpful in having a better understanding on that. I would suggest, Nis, we move directly to the next presentation by Jess and have then an overall discussion, and we'll open the room also for questions that can be addressed to both presenters. So thank you very much again, Mogopodi, and please, Jess, you can start. If Mogopodi, you can close your sharing.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Emily. Let me just get my slides up. There we go. Okay, so I think hopefully you can all see those now. Great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed listening to Professor Lekorwe's presentation, and I'm glad because I think mine will fit on his quite well, just in the sense that it's not quite so detailed in certain areas, but it will perhaps add a layer of alternative questions that we can ask. Obviously, Botswana and South Africa are neighboring countries. And whilst they have very different histories on certain levels, there's also, particularly in the pre-colonial encounters, there's quite a lot of shared structure and quite a lot of shared experience in certain aspects of the experience and the traditions that exist. So hopefully we can find many places together. It's really nice to be back with a group largely from Middlesex. I've spent some very happy times at Middlesex University in Mauritius. And thank you for the opportunity to think with you all. And for me to come into a new area of scholarship that I fully disclose I'm not 100% versed in, and that's why I start with some context and a disclaimer. But that is very interesting for me as a scholar, and given a recent shift into the business school. So I had half of a career as an anthropologist and social scientist, and have recently started working in the management science context at the University of Cape Town, something I'm really enjoying. But it's also fascinating to see the different ways in which these questions are framed. And I hadn't come across this particular framing of administrative traditions before, but have found myself finding much to think with it. So I'm going to start with a little context and then an invitation to shift perspective slightly, particularly given that so much of the literature is based in the global north, which, as Emily mentioned, and my colleague Esther Salvi, who's on the call as well, has been working with me on this paper where we really push forward the argument that the global north should be considered the minority world, because so much of the experience between a country like Mauritius, Botswana, South Africa, Brazil has shared foundation, shared experiences. And when we re-articulate it as a majority experience, in dialogue with scholarship from the minority world, we then start opening up different theoretical possibilities in terms of our work. So what I'm going to share are just some factors of consideration to understand present administrative systems in South Africa, as well as the contemporary realities, particularly looking at different traditions in what we would consider the public sector, so government services, versus the private sector, which has its own regulatory and kind of economic incentive environment. And then I do want to conclude with a short reflection on digital systems, which increasingly are shaping our experiences. The fact that we are having this call on Zoom is indicative of a wider set of conversations that I think we need to have, because more and more how we administer anything and what traditions are kind of become manifest in the 21st century have to do with the basic outlines of the software and the hardware to some extent that we use. So in terms of the context and disclaimer, as I mentioned, I'm an anthropologist. My training has been very much in deep ethnographic experiences and exposure. Largely, I started my work in Angola and did a lot of scholarship there, and then spent 3 years living in Mauritius and teaching there. That's why Adila and I know one another quite well. It's lovely to connect. And increasingly have been working in Mauritius as well. Then moved back to South Africa, and you'll see the final book there was just a project, or a kind of public scholarship project about how we change narratives in conditions of crisis and what might happen when we, again, shift perspective in different directions. But I'm very much now in this management space and enjoying the opportunity to engage in new ways with you all. So I want to acknowledge that when it comes to South Africa today, our president has just been inaugurated this morning. So we are at a very interesting moment in terms of administrative traditions in South Africa with the emergence of a new government, the GNU, the Government of National Unity, which the cartoonists are having a wonderful time with. But it is an important moment because after 30 years of governance by the African National Congress, the liberatory post-apartheid political entity, we're now in a moment where we will see much more coalition, much more negotiation, a whole set of interesting conversations about how you really adjust to what has now become a consolidated post-apartheid reality. So I'll speak briefly to that history, but we're in a different political moment. I want to then share this image, which one or two of you may have seen before, but is an image that I frequently use when giving these kind of talks, and it speaks to the impetus of a lot of the teaching work and the research that I'm doing. So some of you looking at this won't know what you're actually seeing, and that would be completely unsurprising. I often get, this is some kind of Rorschach block, psychological test, something like that. But if you look at the top left corner, you'll see South Africa, and that might help you orientate yourself towards an inverted map of the world. Because of course, in the same way that the global North and global South are kind of social constructs in certain ways, there is no such thing as up or down in space. North is very much a social and political reality that has been inscribed in the last 500 years of scholarship. And putting the global North on the top of the world does something quite powerful to the ways that all of us imagine the dominance of particular kinds of traditions. So to put North on top is simply a tradition, an administrative tradition in action. And what I think this seminar series and set of conversations is doing very powerfully is inviting us to consider different perspectives, different ways of engaging with history and with the world. And personally, I find this image can be useful for that. And so also thinking about how we prioritize land versus oceans, because of course oceans are spaces of connection, spaces of migration, spaces of voyages. On the other side of Africa, you see Brazil, and we often forget that more slaves were taken from Angola to Brazil than from the rest of Africa to the Caribbean and North America combined. But because of the dominance of the Anglophone, the English-speaking narrative in the world, we hear a lot more about the North American experience of slavery than we do of the Brazilian one, unless, of course, you speak Portuguese. So that's just the kind of overall frame, and I'm going to come back to this image at the end of the talk, so please just hold it in mind. The history, I'm not going to give the kind of history that Professor Lekorwe gave, but rather I just want to acknowledge 4 periods of historical relevance in South Africa. So the first is that we had the pre-colonial period, and so until the colonial era, there were several sophisticated, in many ways very advanced societies living in the area that has since become South Africa. In Cape Town, where I am now, you had the Khoisan indigenous people, who are some of the world's oldest living people. In terms of genetics, we're largely descended from them, most of us, everybody on the call. And then there were several different migrations of groups that would be classified by being part of the Bantu language group. Again, some coming from the north, including areas of Botswana. I'm obviously not going to get into all of this kind of the detail of this history, but it's important to acknowledge that Africa has been populated for longer than anywhere else on Earth, and that those populations have been engaging with one another in all sorts of interesting ways. Some groups, like the Kingdom of the Zulu, for example, have been quite active in terms of fighting for territory, in terms of securing traditional rights. Other groups have been less militaristic, perhaps, but also highly sophisticated in terms of cultural productivity, and of course in terms of administration, because you don't have society without an administrative tradition of some kind. The question is, was it written down in a way that made sense to the colonial people who arrived from the 1500s onwards? And South Africa's colonial history, interesting, slightly different, in that the Dutch were here, and then the British were here, and then there was a whole war, and the effects of that war are still felt today between English-speaking white South Africans like myself and Afrikaans-speaking white South Africans, who often have like significant antagonism. And I'm now happily married to a Mauritian, but had I brought an Afrikaans speaker home, that would have been much more difficult for my parents than anyone else in South Africa. Black, white, Indian, doesn't matter. But there are these kind of really interesting tensions between different groups, both the colonial groups and the other ethnic and linguistic groups that have made up this territory for a long time. And at the same time, people have been getting on with it and living together and finding ways to live successfully for 500 years of history. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the historic barbarity of apartheid, which was a system of enforced segregation, whereby with the aid of a whole bunch of really interesting and really scary administrative traditions, the country was divided into different groups, and each group was administered in a completely different way. There were real limitations on who could own what, who could sleep where, who could use what toilets. And I always think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the genesis of apartheid ideology came from Europe's World War II and came from the United States. So teams of South Africans were literally sent to the United States to understand how the reservation system was managed in the US at the turn of the century and in the early 1920s. And this formed the foundation of a lot of the egregious legal structures that comprised high apartheid. And so this period of significant racial segregation, which changed 30 years ago. And South Africa gets in a lot of trouble and gets a lot of hate globally for all its many, many, many problems, all of which I acknowledge. But I also think it's incredible that as somebody in a mixed race relationship 30 years after that became legal, the extent to which people have accepted the change and the extent to which in one generation, almost everybody has had to do a major shifting of ontological framing of how you see the world, of how you move about the world and who you move with. And through that process, you've had this emergence of new administrative traditions that are certainly fraught. They're certainly contested. It's certainly difficult in terms of the inequality that we see. But at the same time, there have been incredible shifts in 30 years that when you look at a country like the United States, you really see how South Africa has actually come very, very far. There's the creation of a Black middle class that simply didn't exist 30 years ago, 40 years ago. You have access to sort of cultural and social and economic opportunities for some that certainly wasn't possible before. Is it enough? Absolutely not. Is it a constant process of work? Absolutely it is. But one thing you find in South Africa is that most people are willing to do that work and at least are trying, however painful that attempt can be. So I do think it's important to highlight that though there are plenty of South Africans who've left, Mauritius is full of them and many other countries as well. But for the most part, those who have stayed, who have economic means, are quite committed to a different future. And those who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum are also trying quite hard on a daily basis to create new kinds of traditions. So I think that's important to state. And then the last thing there is just that South Africa is a microcosm of global systems in one geographic space. And I do feel that it's really challenging to see inequality so close, and that if I literally go 2 kilometers from my house, I'll land up in a high density, low income township. But my experience of crossing from San Diego in the United States to Mexico City, to Tijuana in Mexico, was exactly that same process, that you have a global system where the minority world overconsumes and the majority world underconsumes. And in many places, you'll have Europe with the Mediterranean and then North Africa. You'll have North America and South America. You have these global structures, the Pacific Islands and Australasia, where labor and large bodies of human beings who are quite poor are kept out at a sort of military and industrial way from those who overconsume. And the difference in South Africa is simply that we rub up against this reality in the same country every day. It's very difficult, it's very painful, it's sometimes quite dangerous, but I do think that it allows us to see the realities of the global economic and social system in interesting ways. So what I've decided, rather than going into the kind of nuts and bolts of all of it, is I just want to invite you to consider some of these points in terms of understanding the present post-apartheid, so post-1994 systems of administration. And I agree completely with Professor Lekorwe when he said that it's difficult to say that there's one administrative tradition, because right from inception, we've had, in our case, British and Dutch colonial administrative precedents layering onto indigenous, and I put that word in inverted commas because it's quite a loaded term, and there are lots of other words you can use, but call it pre-existing administrative traditions. But it's not like the colonial governments arrived to this kind of blank slate. There were lots of established ways of doing things, and those in themselves were contested within the territory by different groups of people. So Xhosa speakers versus Zulu speakers versus Khoisan, for example. And at different moments in history, different groups have kind of leveraged administrative tradition to control either the economy, the population, and so on in different kinds of ways. There have always been multiple traditions of recording and transmitting knowledge, and they've always worked at the same time. So even when you had a system that said everybody's identity document will appear in this particular way with these particular race groups, for example. Firstly, there've been mixed race babies in South Africa since the beginning of history. And also people have had many other ways of recording and transmitting their knowledge. And whilst there's a degree of compliance with the state, there's also a sense of needing to work with one another in many different ways. I see something on the chat. I'm not going to read it, but please just interrupt me if I'm taking too long or something. The other thing is that different sectors have different embedded practices, which have been more or less shaped by political realities. And so I won't go into the details there, but it's not a uniform system of administration across the board. A lot of it is driven by key legislation before, during, and after apartheid. Whole set of legislation in colonialism, whole set of legislation in apartheid, whole set of legislation post-apartheid, which has determined what is possible in terms of how administration works. And that also this has layered onto differing education and higher education sectors. So administration is conducted by human beings, you know, call me an anthropologist with this, but it really does determine, it does matter what language somebody speaks, what school they went to, what their social networks are, what kind of technological aptitude or exposure they might have, and who taught them, what opportunities were exposed to them, and so on. And again, in South Africa, you see many, many different experiences knocking up against one another. We have one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world. We have 12 official languages, one of which is South African Sign Language. Most South Africans speak at least 5 languages, which is something that, again, when you look, like, our reading scores might be terrible at grade 5 primary school. But the ability of everyday South Africans to move through, again, what become administrative traditions, both oral and written, is quite significant. I don't think I'm going to have much time to get into the moment of decolonization and some of the sort of geopolitical and especially student-driven pushes towards a sort of imagined version of the future that is much more grounded in African realities, but it's important. I'm also not going to have much time to look at the impact of Black economic empowerment, which is a set of legislation that has enabled and compelled the emergence of a Black middle class that, again, didn't exist before. But I want to highlight that in each organization, these things play out differently. And depending on what one is looking for and how one is trying to work the system, one might need to focus on different things. So I wanted to give a few examples. I'm going to be very brief with this, but in terms of the sort of everyday experience of most South Africans or people living in South Africa, you have you have the public and the private sector, which become very important. So Capitec Bank, for example, is a relatively recent entry into the financial space. It's a bank that serves the entire population. I have an account people who clean my office have an account. Everybody has an account with Capitec, but it's a private sector company that is responsive to the kind of benefits and in some way or sort of best practices in the global corporate sphere. Versus Home Affairs, which is our notoriously complicated institution that issues marriages, death certificates, identity documents, birth certificates, all of that. And Home Affairs has really come out of the apartheid era administrative tradition and has found it very difficult to actually become a system that meets the needs of all South Africans efficiently. It does meet the needs, but it doesn't do so efficiently. And so if you need to go to Home Affairs, you will spend 6 hours of your morning, if you're lucky, in a queue. And of course, this is something that unites South Africans across race, class, gender, religion, because everybody has to get an ID document, and it's equally painful for everybody. At the same time, schooling becomes really, really important in this space. So in apartheid, you had a highly differentiated schooling system where those who were not white received much inferior quality education to those who were white. Now what we've seen is that there is still the legacy of those schools and the teachers in them and the infrastructure, but now increasingly what you have is private schools that cater to all race groups, but the distinction, again, quite similar to Mauritius, now becomes one of economic advantage. So you can be in a township environment, but you can easily go to a private school, which will have the sort of best resources if your parents can afford it. But depending on the experience of education, which offers completely different exposure for, again, into administration, into language, into university, and so on, you then have very different life opportunities mapped out for you. I want to talk briefly, and I'll wrap up soon, but just kind of mentioning that increasingly our experiences are shaped by digital systems, which determine the ways that we work. It determines the ownership of data. There are questions around what kind of data can move across systems and where. Do we store our data on servers in the United States, for example? Do we serve them here? There's emerging legislation around this, but all of this maps onto a differentiated structure of digital capabilities. So it's one thing just putting the internet in, but it's another thing ensuring that your administrators know how to use the internet. And it's another thing, again, to ensure that there is capacity to have structures across the board that are responsive and able to serve millions and millions of people at one time. So during the recent elections, the entire system crashed. And it was very clear that this very expensive technology wasn't going to work. But luckily, because we're resilient and we have some experience of this stuff, everybody knew that was possible. And so we had a very efficient analog backup system, which carried the elections extremely well. But again, if you're a private sector entity, you can invest in things like software and staff training in a way that you can't if, for example, you're in Home Affairs. This has huge implications for cost, huge implications for futures. I know in my university, because of the exchange rate changes between the dollar and the rand, we can no longer afford certain kinds of software that the university used to rely on. So now we build our own, but we build our own, and sometimes it takes time for the glitches to be figured out. There are ways in which this digital inequality increasingly shapes who's able to work efficiently, and we can unpack that a little bit in many ways, and who isn't at different levels. So I think that to think about administrative traditions, we really need to think about the ownership of digital systems, who gets to innovate, how are they governed, all of these questions. Now, I'm sharing this slide just almost at the end, but just to say, this was an experience where when I gave my current job interview, I needed to give a talk very similar to this and you know, go into the talk. Fine. And the administrator asked me 5 minutes before, please, can you upload your slides onto the Google Drive, because that will, you know, as a backup, no problem. So I do that. Now you can imagine my horror when this is what happened. So, and I checked it the other day, this still happens on Google. So if I upload an inverted map of the world onto Google, the algorithm takes it upon itself to correct my slides, because the algorithm has decided that Africa should be represented in one particular way from one particular set of experiences. Now, this is very much our administrative reality, right? It's literally Google or Meta Alphabet is saying, this is the way that you should see the world. And if you want to work outside of that, our systems, our technologies are not actually going to allow you to do that. And for me, that really captured what is at stake in having these conversations and how we go forward. So the questions that I want to kind of leave us with are, how do we theorize a plurality of administrative traditions that exist together within the same organization, country? We can extrapolate that. How do individual biographies, educational trajectories, and social networks impact on the manifestation of administrative traditions? In post-apartheid South Africa, what are the parameters of tradition as relevant to administration? Because this becomes a very gnarly area, you know, whose traditions, how are they contested? How might movements such as the decolonial turn manifest in administrative environments? And then, of course, what are the impacts of digital systems on contemporary administration and the emergence of new traditions? So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jess, for this really interesting presentation as well, and really interesting insight also regarding what Google Sheets does with our presentations and predefines how we shall see the world. I just want to quickly mention also the idea of the project we envisage is not only kind of a cross-cultural national project, but it's also a transdisciplinary project. And that's why that's what we also saw today with your presentation by Jess, having a different perspective due to the background in anthropology and asking different questions, which is exactly what we also want to do. So thank you to both speakers again. I hand over now to Adila for the Q&A discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Lekorwe. Thank you, Professor Auerbach as well. Really, really rich conversation and really, really insightful food for thought for us as well. And I know that we are a little bit tight on time, so we appreciate everyone who is behind. But if in case anyone has to leave, we do understand that. And Mamdin and I will work better on timekeeping in the future for our webinars. Anyone with any question, I will go straight to anyone who raises their hand first. Otherwise, I'll lead with a question, but I'm giving anyone the chance first. Okay, until I hand. Okay, thank you, Mustafa. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Sorry for my English, it's not fluent, but I just try to do my best so that you can understand what I mean. I'd just like to ask a question after thanking them for the rich conferences. I don't know if there is any religious power in Botswana or South Africa, like here in Senegal. If so, what is the nature of the relation between the state and religion in Botswana or South Africa?
Thank you, Mustafa, for a very straightforward question. Jess or Mogopodi, would you like to take it, the question?
I'm sure. I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. I think it is a very important question, and not just in Africa, because of course, looking at the role of religion in the US elections, for example, at the moment becomes really interesting. I mean, we do have a religiously plural constitution in South Africa that makes it quite clear what the rules are in terms of religious diversity. And again, we have a system where many people will both identify as Christian and then seek the support of indigenous healers, for example, and people who operate out of maybe an alternative system. But the church, the Christian church in South Africa is important and does have political and social sway. And I think it's really important, again, to recognize how those networks, religious networks, often are not discussed nearly as much as other dimensions of diversity, for example, but become incredibly important. So in my teaching in inclusive innovation, I find that religion is by far the most complex area to discuss properly with the students, because people know how to talk about race. They know how to talk about gender. They know how to talk about class and socioeconomic diversity. But when it comes to religion, because it's hitting something so fundamental about what a person really believes is right or wrong, you have situations where people are reluctant to say, I would never marry a person of a different faith in a way that they would never say, I would never marry somebody of a different race, for example. And depending on which religious group you're speaking about, those often do have quite significant political and social connections and therefore influence in certain traditions. And I find it interesting because you're having to deal with the future, the afterlife, as well as the present life. And that has real implications for what decisions people make in the world. And it plays out in South Africa in very complex ways, but it's certainly a factor. And thanks for raising it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also believe that it's the same as in South Africa. The constitution is open in terms of the freedom of association of religion. But just like South Africa, Christianity is very, very important. That is why, especially during the times of elections, where you see political leaders going to almost all the churches in the country. So they are all inclusive. But as we say, religion is something that is emotive, and it just remains like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Regana.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you again for the very, very insightful presentations. I just wanted to know, so I come from a very interesting space. I'm also connected to UCT, but in a different capacity. And I'm actually working in the public service as well. So the question that I have, and obviously I'm very much juxtaposing to this reality, listening to the two case studies. I think my question links specifically to the South African context where Jess said we don't have a uniform system of legislation, and that is in fact true. But I think for how all of this deep layering from the colonial era all the way to where we're finding ourselves with the Constitution, and all of this mix of realities we've actually got, and then a private sector that doesn't quite shift in the same way. Maybe just an opinion around what does that mean and how does it translate for public sector administration? And the key thing about crafting new kinds of traditions. What are those new kinds of traditions we're trying to craft? That's digital layering on top of it. But I just feel that the reality is you're almost sitting with two kinds of worlds. You've got a world that's trying to transform and it's slow. And then you've got this other sort of world that just keeps going at a speed. And how exactly, what does that tradition then look like for public administration, or at least the traditions that's linked to that? I hope I'm trying to articulate this to the best of my ability. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Regana. It's a dense and complicated question, and I'm wondering what the best way to answer it is, because I think you really highlighted the fact that in South Africa there are many worlds, and so we both work at University of Cape Town. It is very rare for a University of Cape Town graduate, for example, to consider working in the public service. Whereas it is not that rare for, I used to work at Northwest University, a very, very different institution. And that the public service is where almost all of our students landed up getting employed. And it does feel that a lot of the kind of life trajectories are quite polarized. And that's reflected in the kind of tremendous inequality, I think, in our society as the most unequal society in the world. And I think that what you're articulating there about that need to try to find ways to bridge boundaries, for example, is absolutely critical. And that's something that I hope this new government of national unity might enable to become something of a stronger project, because what you've seen so far is that it hasn't really been necessary at a political level. Whereas now that we have these political parties that also represent those different worlds to some extent coming together and having to work with one another, I think it might force a conversation about these differences and the ways in which people have to cross boundaries. But it's entirely possible in South Africa to live in one system or the other and have very, very little opportunity to ever engage with the other spaces. That's why I chose Capitec as an example to think about, and Home Affairs, because this particular private sector bank is one that actually does service most South Africans across socioeconomic levels and again, traditions. And Home Affairs, of course, services all South Africans, whether they like it or not. And for me, those are the really interesting institutional spaces where even if it's just at the level of the user or the customer, you're forced to kind of encounter these differences that in South Africa, other than home affairs, as a wealthy South African, you do not have to encounter many of the structures that shape other South Africans' lives, particularly because of things like the health sector being completely privatized at certain levels as well. So, I mean, again, it's such a great question. I'd love to meet for coffee and we can chat about it more, because you open up a horde of things. So I've just added you on LinkedIn. Please,
Sure. No problem. No problem. If I may, I'm sorry, I know I'm pushing a little bit. I was very interested in this the one point that was made around the decolonialization and the student movement. And I think there is a truism that there have been things that have been happening long before the British has ever arrived here. But for example, a decolonial movement, like we're talking about Fees Must Fall as a very recent example, but actually we had Sharpeville as well during the apartheid era. And I don't know how those two are juxtaposed or even sort of compared ever in our sort of our history and as part of our traditions. But yes, absolutely, we can continue the conversation. But thank you for taking my questions. Truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and for a very thought-provoking question as well, Regina. And it's also about a form part of discussion that we want to have, that there are always transformations that are happening, and we have to be mindful of where they are happening and how they are happening. And you've mentioned the pace as well, which it is happening, and fast adaptation, or if it is a slow adaptation as well. Why is that happening? Is it a wrong thing that in case there's a slower rate as well? We need to understand the context and the different factors. And some key messages as well to extract from both presentations today, that both different countries, yes, there are a few common areas that overlap and so on, but there is they didn't start with zero sort of administration. They have been pre-existing. I appreciate as well the cautiousness when using the word indigenous, but pre-existing administrations have been there. We have to understand how they have faded away over time, why that happened, or how they have infiltrated as well contemporary realities. So, and which is what we would like to be mindful of in future conversation. And I really, really appreciate Jess's beginning statement that the global north maybe, shifting the perspective, and the fact that maybe in the context here, the minority and the richness in the global south is a majority that we need to explore, and that would advance future conversations that we need to have. So I know we are short on time, and anyone else, perhaps one final question or some concluding remarks? If not, then we would really have loved to welcome everyone over coffee and to continue this conversation. Perhaps in the future, we'll think of other ways as well. Yes, Imamdin, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, again, thank you to the presentation, and also Regina, to your question, which actually foreshadows to the project we're envisioning. And it also made me remember on one of the inaugural presentations we had by Joel Botelho, who is actually also involved in this project, when he talked about the concept of institutional void, like a concept often kind of particularly coming from economics, and saying in countries from the majority world, as we learned today, there aren't institutions, which isn't true, and that's exactly what we want to do. We want to show there have been institutions before the colonial time, so we want to have these voices heard now and build on that. What does it mean exactly when we change current administrations, in what form, in which pace, and so on? So that's exactly where we want to go to. And I think the insights we got today were very helpful and bring us a step closer to that. Thank you. And yes, just I see the question. Yes, the recordings will be made online on our YouTube channel. I usually send an email also with the link then a few days later.
I believe Metkel will be doing the concluding slides for us. Mitkel, microphone is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adila, and thank you everyone for these very interesting presentations and questions. I'm not going to hold you any longer, but I'm going to make you wait in very much appreciation for the next webinar that is going to happen on the 18th of September. So as you have heard already, and in the same spirit as in the end mentioned already, we would like to delve a little bit more into different cultures and administrative traditions. And that is why we are going to listen to Professor Crisanto Barros from Cape Verde and Mustafa Mbenge, which we've already heard today. They are going to present the administrative traditions in Cape Verde and in Senegal. So time is already, as mentioned, also clear from 2 to 3:30 p.m., which is the same time like now. And we hope to see you back then again. And please stay connected to see and hear more about also what we are doing, about new developments and discussions that we are leading. You can find us on LinkedIn, on X or Instagram, and obviously on our website. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you soon again. Back to you, Adila.
Thank you, Mitkel. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Have a nice day, evening, or afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.